Welcome, everybody. This is Dr. Grace Telesco, and we're live streaming from the Fischler College of Education School of Criminal Justice. I'm a full-time faculty member at the school, and we have these regular monthly programs that are dedicated specifically to the show Unfound and the host of that show, Ed Dentzel. And every single month, we look at different missing persons cases, different cold missing persons cases. And so without any further ado, I'd like to bring on my dear friend and guest for tonight, Ed Dentzel. And he is, again, the host of the show. It's a podcast, Unfound. He has a regular program, and it's aired on YouTube and also a podcast channel, right? Did you want to?
iTunes, Spotify, everywhere podcasts are.
Perfect. So Ed is a dear friend. We've been working together now for a long time. How many is it? A year? It's over a year, right?
I was just telling your assistant Brendan that we started in May of 2020, and I'm estimating this is probably like the 11th or 12th show we've done.
That's great, and we do it every single month. I think we missed 1 month only, but we've been doing it every single time. And one of the shows that we did was the anatomy of a cold missing persons case. And so I asked that if he would kind of revisit that for so many of our introduction to criminal justice students and our master's students and our PhD students, and also your viewers and your followers that are interested in, how do you do this? How do you tackle this cold case of a missing person? And how do you go about the investigative journalism that's behind everything that you do? And one of the things that I always say I love about you, besides there's so many, we don't have enough time in the hour, disc golfer that you are, and all the other things that you are. But, Ed is a journalist. He's also an actor, a filmmaker, and author. And he's, besides being the host of Unfound, so he's done a lot of work, and he's dedicated his life now to giving voice to those who remain unfound. And he gives voice not only to them, but to their families. And he never puts a spin on anything. He doesn't like to give theory behind these cases. He just likes to report the facts as a good journalist does. And so without any further ado, thank you again, Ed, for taking the time out of your schedule to enlighten us about what goes into a missing persons case and investigating one, especially from a journalist's perspective.
Okay.
That's all.
It's good. It's good to be back on the show here in September, September 2nd. While I'm doing this, I want to wish my brother, Brent, a happy birthday. It's his birthday today, September 2nd. But yes, there's a whole bunch of ways that we can talk about missing persons cases. And given that we have kind of tackled this topic before, but you wanted to, being that it's a new school year, we wanted to talk about this particular topic again. We're going to cover it in a little bit different way this time. And I'm hoping this will be a good foreshadowing of when I join all of you down there in Southern Florida in November. I can't wait to come down there. So I think some of the things that we'll be talking about tonight will be covered when I'm there live in person. We talked about, November 4th. Hopefully we can make that happen. So in thinking about the anatomy of a missing persons case, I've broken it down this time into 3 different topics. I know the people who follow Unfound love or know how I love to break any topic down into 3 main points. I think probably 2 is not enough and 4 maybe is too many. 3 main points. And so these are the 3 main topics that we will be covering regarding the anatomy of a missing persons case tonight. Number 1, there is rarely ever any proof that a crime was committed. Number 2, everyone moves on but the family. And number 3, the passing of time can have both benefits and detriments. So those are the 3 topics we will be covering. We will be getting into them much deeper in a few moments. But first we have to think about what exactly is a missing persons case. It's actually very simple. I think maybe the public thinks that, well, there has to be signs that, that something happened. There were signs of violence, but the person is missing. There's probably a lot of misconceptions about what an actual missing persons case is. And it's actually very simple. It's that the person was here one day, the person is gone the next, and there's no explanation as to where he or she may be. Maybe she was supposed to show up for work, didn't show up. Maybe somebody says they're going on a vacation and they don't end up there. Maybe it could even be two people together. There are actually, surprisingly, quite a few disappearance cases where two people have disappeared together. We've covered quite a few of those on the program. So it's just simply that a person who has, a life, a marriage, children, a job, interests, hobbies, all of those things, has a pattern to his or her life. At some point, the person just isn't doing those things anymore, and there are no signs of where that person might be. And they're all unique, although they can be broken down into different categories that I will detail in a few moments. But something important, as I've learned, and you should know that I've been doing the program for 5 years. In fact, tomorrow, Unfound celebrates its 5th anniversary. Started this program the first Friday of September 2016. But before that, I was just like all of you, taking an interest in true crimes of all types, murders, serial killers, disappearances. And then I started Unfound, and now I am a specialist in missing persons cases. And one of the things I know that I've learned over the last 5 years is just because a disappearance seems like it should be put in a particular category does not necessarily mean so. And you have to start really looking really deep at the facts, and do they make sense? And then you look at other disappearances that seem to be like it and try to determine, can we learn something from both and apply it to both? So some examples of disappearance types. These are some of the most common ones that we've covered as categories on Unfound. Man says wife/girlfriend just took off, and to which I always say, some of those disappearances are Rosemary Rapp, Marion Hurley, Angela Greene, Lisa Wallace. And we could even go the opposite way with a man going missing, maybe that way as well. Maybe we might pick out the disappearance of Bradley Allen, once again, a disappearance that Unfound has covered. Once again, this is a situation where a guy, for example, man and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, married, whatever situation, they go to bed. The guy gets up the next morning and says, she's not here. And so he ends up filing a missing persons report. But most of the time, her car is there, her phone is there, her purse is there, her money's there, her clothes are there. And a lot of times we kind of suspect what went on, but once again, there is no signs of a crime. But that is a very familiar scenario where a man says that his wife, girlfriend, a woman that he's in a relationship with just took off. She went out, got into a white pickup truck with somebody, and just rode off. And I'm not making that up. That story has actually been told a couple different times in a couple different disappearances that we've covered. The next very familiar, very common type of disappearance has to do with addicts. And what goes on with the disappearance of addicts or people who are involved in the drug business, you get a lot of stories. Now, some of those disappearances that we've covered like that could be Noah Davis, Chip Campbell, Billy DiSilvestro, Laura Bible, and Ashley Freeman. And the tough thing is trying to wade through all of the stories that you hear. And as I've said many times, and anybody who listens to the program who is watching this right now knows, one of the things I always say about this type of disappearance is these people who allegedly know something or are witnesses or whatever else, they can tell you everything but what you really want to know. They could say that I heard this rumor, or I heard from this guy, who heard from this guy, all these sorts of stories. And what ends up being true in these types of disappearances, as I think is the case with Noah Davis, his remains have been found, is that a lot of these are just overdoses. People who had overdoses, they were in the process of overdosing and walking off. The problem is all the people around that person are addicts. They have trouble keeping track of their days. They don't sleep for days. Their memories are not good. And that's where all of these, what I would call crazy stories, come from. But that's another very common type of disappearance. The next one would be the walk-off. And this is just simply, we were in the house, he got up, went to the front door, walked off, never to be seen again. Some of these types of disappearances are Joshua Guimond, Chance Engelbert, Patricia Taylor, Renee Lamanna. Now, within that, though, there are very specific subcategories, but really the walk-off is there's no allegations that there was any foul play. There's no allegations that that an accident happened. It was simply really just that the person was sitting here, right here, and then took off for seemingly no reason. Now, some of these might be lies, and some of these might be cases of foul play that people are covering up. They're saying that the person walked off when he or she really didn't. But as I do this program more and more and more, once again, about 225 disappearances now, I have started to believe more of these walk-off scenarios. In that, for example, just that first one, Joshua Guimond at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. He's in a dorm with friends, and all of a sudden he just got up and left. Everybody thought he was either going to the bathroom or going back to his own dorm. Never seen again. Searches, there were lakes in the area that were searched. The woods in the area were searched. Josh was gone. These things are real. And so for the public out there that's watching this that think, well, these things just don't happen, they do. They absolutely do. And then we kind of have a catch-all category, I would say the unexplained, where they're just so unique that they cannot be put into any category whatsoever. And I'm just going to name some names. Jason Jolkowski, he was walking to meet a coworker at a local school so this coworker could drive into work. Somewhere between his house and the school, he went missing. Broad daylight, Omaha, Nebraska, 2001, never seen again. Good young kid, 19 years old, no problems with the law or drugs or no shady business whatsoever. And he's still missing 20 years later. Dale Kerstetter, that's from Pennsylvania, had to do with the theft of platinum from a window making plant. Kristen Modafferi in San Francisco. Brian Schaefer, probably one of the most well-known disappearances that we've ever covered on Unfound. He went missing in Columbus, Ohio. It was a situation where it seems he went into a bar. The video shows him walking in. The video does not show him walking out. It's as if he went into this bar and poof into thin air. And his disappearance, I think, is about 15 years old now, and it is still unsolved. Once again, these are ones that are hard to categorize. So that brings us to the first topic. And I should say, Dr. Telesco, if you'd like to jump in anytime, any comments or anything, please do. Okay. Number one, as I stated before, there is rarely any proof that a crime was committed. And I could say that for all of those disappearances that I've just named, there's no proof that any crime was committed. We rarely ever talk about blood. We rarely ever talk about fingerprints. We rarely ever talk about DNA unless remains are found. These are, of course, topics that would be very common if this was an unsolved murder program. Okay, but it's not. With disappearances, a lot of it is circumstantial.
Right.
And what I think makes this all difficult is we are now in the era of DNA, social media, and everything else. And as I have written in my notes, disappearances are much more like Columbo episodes, and I think I'm showing my age there, where a lot of intuition must be used, that you must know a lot about other disappearances to be able to look at this particular disappearance the right way, because you're not going to get anything from science. You're just not going to get it. Whereas in a murder, of course, you have the body. You most likely know who that person is fairly quickly. You can talk to those people and find out what that person was doing. You're going to know the murder weapon. You're going to be able to get the timeline really, really tight. In disappearances, it's all the exact opposite.
So Ed,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna interrupt a minute, and just for a lot of our
Sure.
viewers, especially our undergrads, our grads, and our PhD candidates, who love and thirst for forensics, and CSI, the CSI effect, if you will, right?
Yeah,
So
right. Yes.
influenced by that, and Hollywood a lot of times. So how much of this is forensics and how much of this is investigative skill?
It's 99% investigative skill, and it's 1% any type of science. It's just, I know that, once again, being from having done some movies myself, and I know there's the need for entertainment in many of these true crime shows, programs like CSI, etc. That is not how disappearances are. And in fact, I would say that there was once that TV show Without a Trace, which was a disappearance show. That's not close to reality either. But we certainly do have the CSI effect that's been going on for about 20 years. I think that, for example, juries expect a lot more these days. Yes. They want to hear about DNA. And if you don't have that as a prosecutor, if you have all this other information, but you don't have DNA, it's much more likely the jury is going to find a suspect not guilty. Now, he may very well be not guilty, but the mere fact of not having any DNA or really scientific evidence could ruin it. Could absolutely ruin it. And that's what makes disappearances so difficult.
And the other thing about it isn't it true also that it's very tedious. This is a tedious thing. This is like those of your followers who are so loyal, your loyal listeners, right?
And many, yes.
And if I have any loyal followers as well, it's exciting. We talk about this in an hour, we give summary, but the true inner workings of this is a very tedious and long process with more questions than answers. But that's not what we see on television, right?
That's not. And I think, yes, I would say that, and I even have this written in my notes, and I'm not doing this off the top of my head, that what I think where everybody has suffered in the last 20, 25 years, it used to be, let's go back to the 70s and 80s. I can remember the 70s and the 80s, that it was more intuition because you had less science. You might have some fingerprints and things, but surely DNA did not become a thing until like the 1990s. So detectives, investigators, they had to use a little bit more gut instinct and experience in comparing it to other murderers or whatever else they've covered. I think that has been lost. I do have investigators, former detectives, sheriff's deputies who helped me with the program behind the scenes. And we've talked about this before. I'm not talking out of school here, and it's not necessarily a criticism, but as the science has changed, I think possibly the investigators themselves have, maybe lost some skills that we as humans really do have, but we just don't use them as much. And it certainly is important with disappearance cases, because once again, the science is rarely going to be able to help you because you usually don't have any. You're going to have to infer things and go off on some different tangents just to see what happens, because the science is not going to be able to point you in a direction. I have it written here: nothing in disappearances is clear cut except for the fact that the person isn't here who is usually here. That's the only clear cut fact that you have in any disappearance. Usually, we rarely ever talk about blood or anything being left behind. So continuing with this topic, there's rarely any proof a crime was committed. The tough part is that this puts police in a very tough position, because police investigate, for the most part, crimes. Well, then what are they supposed to do when a person goes missing? Family comes in and says, yes, my 20-year-old daughter, we're not sure what happened to her. And the investigator, or whoever's going to take the report, well, is there any signs of violence? No. Did she sound suicidal? No. Did she have any, a violent boyfriend or somebody? No. at some point, the police start thinking, well, was a crime really committed? This is very common. So the police are put in a very tough position, and you have to understand, investigators just don't throw themselves into unusual circumstances, which that disappearance could be. They throw themselves at crimes, places being robbed, women being raped, cars being stolen, those types of things that are certainly obvious. With disappearances, it's not that way. The other thing that's tough about trying to determine if a crime was committed or not is that the police get a lot of cry wolf situations where a family will, a mother or father will go down to the police department. My 20-year-old daughter's been missing for a couple days. And you'll have some investigator that absolutely 100% wants to help. And he'll take out the report, fill it all out, start asking a lot of questions. And just as she is about to maybe go talk to somebody who could be a suspect, go here or there, here the daughter comes back from Vegas. Here she went out there and didn't tell her parents. Took up vacation while telling her family, maybe she eloped, something like that. And there was, of course, no crime committed. And there she is, good as new. And this happens a lot. And in fact, even with some of the disappearances that I've covered, these people who are missing still years later, it's not unusual for some of these people who we are covering on the program to have gone missing before for a few days. This usually involves people who have addictions. But this is very common. So maybe they'll go missing for 2 days, reappear. Go missing for 3 days, at some point, reappear. Go missing for 2 days, a few months later, reappear. And then they go missing, and maybe people figure, well, he's going to reappear, and then he doesn't. This is very, very common. And this is what makes it so difficult for police. They're in a very tough position. But I still believe what I think I know after 5 years is that still, I think they can do a better job. The media can do a better job. I can do a better job. So what I would say for future investigators at any level, you need to have more curiosity than you would ever need in a murder case. And the reason I combine those two is because most police departments in the United States, unless it's LA, New York City, Chicago, Houston, other than the really, really big police departments, there is no missing persons unit. And what ends up happening is the file ends up getting put on the desk of an investigator in homicide or, robbery or something like that. People who rarely ever have anything to do with missing persons cases. And so what I would tell them is if you get one of these, you probably have to be a little more intuitive, a little more curious than you would usually have to be in whatever your specialty is in that police department. But most importantly, once again, for the topic of this section, there's rarely, in these disappearances we cover, there is rarely ever any proof that a crime was committed. Dr. Telesco, would you like to jump in before we move to part number 2, topic number 2, which is going to be everyone moves on but the family?
Well, one of the things that I wanted, and I definitely want to chime in for that second part, but one of the things that I think is so difficult, we mentioned before the crime scene, CSI effect.
Yeah.
And not only for jurors, but also for the police. And so there's a big setup, right? There's a setup with families, watching these shows that most people watch and most people love, a lot of people do. And they notice that before the hour is up, the crime's been solved. And it's been solved miraculously, magically almost, by this forensic science that just appears. And not to say that forensic science doesn't have its place and that we respect the science of it. However, we know that it's not all tied up in a nice little package by the end of the hour, right? And so what happens is there's an expectation, an unrealistic expectation on the part of the public for how the police respond or how the police can investigate. Now, that's also not to take the police off the hook for those who get what we call confirmation bias, which we've talked about in the past.
Yeah.
Confirmation bias, this tunnel vision, maybe not uncovering every rock that they could uncover and look under. But what could you say to families or those who are watching about not having unrealistic expectations, but more like making your expectations realistic? And how do they do that?
Well, what I see is that, and I've told my guests this is no secret, that most of them, they rely too much on the police because of their perception of how this is all supposed to work. It may come from movies and TV, but it also may come just from our general attitude, at least here in the United States, toward law enforcement. And so they have all this put together and they think, well, the police are just going to take care of everything. And that's just not the way it is. And in fact, in many of the disappearances I've covered, I've covered disappearances that go back to the 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s. And inevitably, they find out that they think that the police are working on it, and they're not. This is not to say that the police are shirking their responsibilities. There's just usually there might not be a lot to do, or more likely, you know what? They have other things to do. Since that disappearance happened in 2000, you know what? A lot of other crimes have been committed, crimes that we know are crimes that are unsolved. Whereas this disappearance, it's hard to tell if there's a crime being committed or not. So how much time are they really supposed to devote to it? This is why I try to tell my guests, I try to give them help. I try to give them things to do when they tell me about their disappearance. And I try to use other disappearances as examples. And I try to go back and forth, learning something from this disappearance and apply to that one, learn something from this one, apply to that one. I try to empower the guests because the police just aren't going to go and do these things. They just don't have the time. They have other things to do. For example, after 20 years. Yeah. So.
And that's the key. The longer these cases go unsolved, the more difficult it is. Now,
yeah, I want to get to that for sure. There's benefits and detriments, and we're going to get to that before we're done here.
Yeah.
So yes. So, but yeah, regarding the family, and that gives us a good segue into part number 2 is everyone moves on, but the family. This is something that all of my guests have experienced, especially I think, particular to the disappearances of people like in their late teens into their 20s, if they have boyfriends, girlfriends, and many friends they've gone to high school with, college with, and then the person goes missing for whatever reason. Maybe we suspect that this person was murdered, maybe no proof of that, or maybe the person just walked off. And those people will, all these other people, these friends will show, care. They'll show up for a search, but eventually they have their lives to live too. And I can tell you that many of my guests, if not all of them, especially if the disappearance is getting old, and you should all know that the average age of a disappearance that we cover on Unfound is about 18 years old. So you start getting to that average age of a 18-year-old case, families can feel very alone because people have moved on. It's not that they don't care. They certainly want John Smith to be found. They certainly want Jane Doe to be found, but they have their lives to live too. They have aspirations in their own lives. Buying a house, moving further in their career, having kids, coaching Little League, etc. They have their things to do. And this is also why, once again, I try to tell these families, you know what, if you want something to happen, it's going to be up to you. Now, some of them have very good relationships with the police departments, the sheriff's offices that are responsible if a crime was committed, but still, these families are still kind of have to do it on their own time. And what the family will talk about as it gets longer, as it goes from 5 years to 7 years to 10 years to 15 years, the big part, and this is going back to murders, this is how murders and disappearances are so different, is that the main thing that my guests tell me, every one of them, almost every one of them, if it comes up, it's the not knowing part, is they're just not sure exactly what happened. With murders, they're of course horrific, they're tragic, they're sad, they're innocent victims, on and on and on. But there is certainly a difference between families who have had a murder occur in their family, a young person, shot dead and being buried and everything, and that family who has that same age person, son, daughter. You just have nothing. You don't know. You just have no idea. There is no sense. We don't really talk about closure on Unfound. It's really not the right word. It's just a resolution. There is no resolution to these cases. And so the not knowing is the worst. And I'll give you a perfect example of how tragic a disappearance can be. I covered the disappearance of Esther Westenbarger from Kokomo, Indiana. She had just retired. She had gotten a buyout plan. She'd worked for one of the automakers, and she was moving back to her hometown of Kokomo. Her brother lived there. Some other family members lived there. She went out one night and with friends, had a couple to drink, and all she had was a mile and a half to drive home. A mile and a half. And I think this disappearance took place in 2009. And there's video of her getting in her car and driving off all by herself, but she never made it home. I will admit that I got this disappearance wrong. Years go by. I had the suspicion that maybe her brother, who was a shady character, still is, had something to do with it, had something to do with her disappearance. A lot of different scenarios, but what it ended up being is not something that I considered at the time, but I do consider it now. Turns out that Esther probably was drinking and driving, and she probably was on the wrong road home, even though it was only a mile and a half. She went through a T intersection, so she's coming up, and the other road goes this way. There's no road extension there. She went right through a stop sign, drove right into a retention pond, and drowned in her car. And her car sat in that retention pond for over 10 years until what happened was the water in this retention pond was cleaned up. Always had like a layer of scum and algae on the top. They put some chemicals, and some kids went out fishing on it. They looked down into the water, and there was Esther's car, and she was in it. It was in drive. The key was on. She certainly drove into that body of water. And here's the tragic part. Her family, while searching for her and living in that area, were driving within feet of her all the time. Here she was in this retention pond just a few yards off this road, and her family was driving by her car and her all the time. These are the types of things that that can cause my guests to really emotionally break down, knowing that they can be so close to solving this disappearance. Now, for me, I look at that disappearance and I've learned so much from that. And this is how close you can be to solving a disappearance and it just be right out of your grasp. And these are the kinds of things this is kind of stuff that haunts my guests, because it very well could be that maybe one of these walk-off scenarios, that their loved one walked off into the woods, had a heart attack, and they're just a few yards into the woods here, but nobody searches it. They don't even know where to look, but it could just be so close to civilization, but so far at the same time. In addition, the other part that you run into regarding all this with regards to everyone moves on, but the families, eventually other people just don't know what to say. You can only offer condolences and everything for so long, because at some point, all you're doing is bringing up a bad memory, and then you're afraid to ask, well, what happened to your son, John Smith? Once again, it all comes rushing back. It all comes rushing back. So when people say, nobody asks me, the guest says, nobody asks me about my daughter anymore, I feel for that. But I also try to make these people understand we have to look at it from, what do you really want them to say? And they feel bad just asking about it, because you may be in a good mood that day. You may, you don't forget about your daughter or son, but you're having a good day. You have your grandkids there. You're planning to go on a vacation, things. And then all of a sudden, somebody calls you up to ask you if you've gotten any word on your son who's been missing for 15 years. What's that going to do to your day? And so this is something that goes on as well. So in the end, it ends up being that the families are pretty much alone. However, looking at it from the police side, something that Dr. Telesco and I have talked about before, and I've talked about like on my live show, it's from the investigator point of view. What upsets me is that these people end up being very good citizens. They follow the police direction. Hey, don't do this. If you suspect that this person did something, do not go to their house. Do not call them out. Do not assault them. And these people follow the law to the letter of the law, trying to just let the police do their job if the police say they're doing something. And even to the point sometimes where investigators have convinced guests not to come on my program, which really, of course, upsets me. But what ends up happening is these people will listen to these investigators. They'll sit back and believe that the police are doing this, doing that. And then what happens? All these investigators end up retiring. The investigator that was on the job at the time of the disappearance, the one after that, the one after that. And so these men and women, they're enjoying their retirement. They're certainly entitled to it. They've earned it. I'm not saying that. But then this family, they still have the same problem. And they never, even though that person's retired, the person never checks back in. Hey, remember me? I'm John Doe. I was your first investigator. I just want you to know that your son is still on my mind. I still think about that case. None of these people ever do any of that. And that's what ticks me off. These people tell them to be patient, be patient, be patient. Then these people retire, and it's if they were, and the police, the families are still left holding the bag. This is, please.
No, I was just going to say, my background with working with families specifically, we've talked about this, I think every single program. I was a first responder at Ground Zero, and I worked directly with the families. And, we're coming up on the 20-year anniversary.
Yeah, hard to believe.
And, so someone who was 20 years old when they perished and were killed at the World Trade Center, or someone in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, or someone at the Pentagon, they're forever 20 years old.
Yep.
Right. So that they don't age. Right. And they don't age in the mind of the family. But what happens is trying to explain that to other people and get other people on board with, like, let's not ever forget them and who they are. And the fact that, is anybody still trying to find them? Is anyone still interested? There was this case I sent you earlier. I don't know if you had a chance to see it.
I got the email you sent me.
Yeah.
Earlier today. I got it, but I did not have a chance to look into it. No, I did not.
So we might have somebody, surprise guest later on, come on for some Q&A, who might be able to answer some of that for that case. We'll see. Special guest, maybe. Let's see. But it was from 2000 to 2001, 3 South Florida women were brutally murdered and their bodies were publicly discarded. Now that's different than not being found.
Right.
And so, but nevertheless, this is something that psychologists talk about for families as complicated grief, which means that it's one thing to be grieving the loss of your loved one, and it's another thing to have so many unanswered questions, and in some cases, never have their sacred remains. And so that they've perished. That they've been killed or have died, more than likely. I think that you gave us those statistics.
Yeah.
But there's no answers. And if there, and like you said, it's very difficult to try to bring this up to people. And it's extremely difficult to try to have law enforcement reopen cases.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're so old, right?
Yeah. Right. I had the disappearance of Chris Turner in Las Vegas that they closed his case right away just because his girlfriend and her mother said, oh, yeah, we saw Chris. He's not missing. Meanwhile, the girlfriend could be responsible for his disappearance. Now, his remains were eventually found and everything, but there's still a decent idea that he was murdered. But Vegas Metro closed his missing persons case, and his mother lost her, I wouldn't say she lost her mind, I know her very well, but anybody knows her knows she was completely crazed by this. And eventually she got it reopened, but it took like 2 years. I don't know why. She's like, I don't know why you did this. Why would you take their word on this? They might be responsible. And still, she just got ignored. Luckily that changed, but it was a good 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know personally many 9/11 families that, have, it's ended in divorce for them. If their child is the one that has, perished in the World Trade Center, let's say, people who have severe depression, post-traumatic stress, anxiety, all of that. And it just kind of goes on hand in hand with this terrible tragedy that just keeps on, like you talk about the gift that keeps on giving. This is the tragedy that keeps on hurting and destroying families.
Yeah.
So, I know I cut you off on what you were about to.
I just want to say one more thing about this particular topic, and then we'll get to the time passing and benefits and detriments, like you mentioned before. Yes. One thing I wanted to mention regarding police, and this just shows you how people move on. This is a true story. I covered the disappearance of Peggy and Patty McDaniel in early, like the spring of 2017. I've gotten to know their mother, Joyce Rivatuso, very, very well. She's one of my favorite people. I'm just going to say it, one of the favorite guests. I keep in contact with her. I've met her in person. And if you're watching Joyce, you know how much I think of you. She lost 2 daughters to a disappearance in 1979, 2. And we believe that they were part of a murder plot, that they were in Live Oak, Florida, but they got taken down to actually the Nova southeastern area of Florida. And they could be connected to an unsolved murder. To this day, it's still unsolved. Well, just a couple years ago, Joyce had gotten some new paperwork from the Pompano Beach Police Department, or maybe the sheriff's office down there, regarding this. And there were some errors, and I really don't want to get into this really specifics, but there was something that was really, really odd. And I got so ticked off. I tracked down the first investigator on the paperwork from 1979 regarding Peggy and Patty's disappearances. I found his phone number. I called him. Seemed like a very nice guy, obviously retired, obviously old. Okay. But in talking to him, it didn't seem to me like he had any failings of his mental faculties or anything like that. And I could find articles in which he was quoted regarding Peggy and Patty's disappearances back from like 1980, 1981. I mentioned their names to him. He didn't even remember them. And these are two daughters who disappeared at the same time. How often does that happen? He didn't even remember them. I had to send him the paperwork so he could see it for himself. This is what I'm talking about. And these things about how people move on, even to the point where investigators don't even remember cases they've worked on, even if it's really, really unique one, like 2 sisters disappearing, and there's a murder, an unsolved murder that's connected to their disappearances. I have to say, it drives me nuts. I was nice with the gentleman. I did not yell at him. I did not swear at him or anything else, but it left me exasperated. So that finishes part number 2 about how, in the end, everyone moves on, but the family.
Yes.
So
now, I'm going to just interrupt for 1 second,
please,
because there's a couple of comments here that I'd like to read that address what you've said so far, if you don't
Sure.
mind. We have 22 viewers right now.
Great.
Which is pretty cool.
Great.
Here's a question for you. Is it common that the investigator cannot force witnesses to help or answer? They lawyer up, quote unquote, for example.
Lawyering up comes up. Probably doesn't come up, at least in the interviews that I do, that often, where a guest says to me, yeah, he got a question and then he went and got a lawyer. It is certainly a thing, but I would not say it's as common as you'd think. And in fact, what's much more common are people who seem like to be suspects being questioned and they just tell outrageous stories. That's much more common.
Yes.
People, men usually telling stories that really don't make any sense. But if you don't have a body, you don't have any signs of death, you don't have any DNA, you don't have these things that we've all talked about. What are you supposed to say? You can't, you can't charge somebody with, there's no law against telling crazy stories.
Right.
For example, we covered the disappearance of Angela Greene. Her husband told 3 different stories regarding her disappearance, including one that, she went to an insane asylum and then she died of a stroke there, but he couldn't name the hospital. He couldn't name where she was buried, nothing. But that's the story he told police. That's much more common than people lawyering up, although that happens too.
Right. Okay. Here's another one. And, Nakia Sanders says the victims are forever young, as we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And also Jahan Clark reminds us that there is no closure. Closure is so important. Miquel Arizmendi says the grieving process is different for everyone. Not having answers is a very difficult thing. But Danelle is asking, Danelle Delaney is asking if a family wants a case to be reopened, can they request that?
You can request it, but good luck with that. Once again, off the top of my head, the only case that I can think of a disappearance where it was closed and it really wasn't what we don't really use the word closure in disappearance. So we just say resolved, was Chris Turner. And Metro did that fairly quickly on the strength of the testimony of Chris's girlfriend and her mother. And there was no proof that they were telling the truth, but Metro closed it. It took them 2 years to get it back open. It's not like you just go down to the police department and say, hey, could you reopen my son's disappearance? That's not how it works. I mean, I'm telling you, Metro, right. And I lived in Las Vegas for 13 and a half years. They did everything they could to avoid reopening that.
Yeah. Lonnie Grabowska is saying the time period is normally not an issue because most cases are felony level investigations. The statute of limitations is longer. If there's new information, it allows the investigators to reopen if the information is pertinent. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of a little bit of an answer to the question, but I liked your candid response, kind of good luck with that.
Yeah. I tend to be very candid about these things.
Yeah.
The families just have to understand if they think that there's an investigation going on in their disappearance of their loved one that's 20 years old, they're wrong. They just have to take for granted that nothing's going on. The police aren't doing anything. I'm not saying, things change. And in fact, I can tell you right now, there's a 35-year-old disappearance that I just happened to have covered recently that I think is going to be somewhat resolved within the next few weeks. It's just a coincidence going on. So these things do happen. Right. Really, they happen by luck. It's just somebody walking in the woods comes across some human remains, not because of any detailed, logical police work or family work, but you still have to do it.
One of my students, Michael, is saying that he thinks about Natalie Holloway. The case was never solved and nobody recovered.
Yep. Yeah, and that guy I forget his name now, but although he did eventually go to jail for something else, he's never done anything for Natalie's disappearance. Yeah.
Right.
And and it gets even more way complex if you're a citizen, like an American citizen, going missing in the Cayman Islands, going missing in Mexico, and going missing in Europe, wherever. It gets way more complicated even than it is if you're an American citizen going missing in the United States.
Yes.
So let's move on to point number 3, being that you already brought this up about the passage of time and what does that mean to a missing persons case. There's good news and bad news. I will go through the detriments first as far as the passing of time. Number 1, people die. Of course, people who might be suspects die, witnesses die, family members die. Of course, if it's a young person who's gone missing, their parents age and die. Of course, the investigators, as I've already talked about, they move away, they retire. Some of them die. And I can't tell you how many investigators I've tried to track down over the last 5 years who aren't alive anymore. Very common. People's memories get fuzzy. So what they said back in 1983 about a disappearance could be different what they're saying now. And then you start to wonder, well, it makes sense to believe what they said in 1983, but it could be here in 2021, what they're saying now actually makes more sense. Believe it. Maybe it makes sense back then, but maybe what they're saying now makes more sense, even though it's something different, very common. People's stories change, lack of media attention. Pretty much every disappearance that I've covered has had one article written on it as a disappearance at the time. But then after a while, the media moves on. They have other stories to cover. There's other things going on in the world. So there's that. And the parents, as I've said, if they don't die, they just get old. They get burned out. And that what ends up happening, and one of the disappearances that just comes to mind is the disappearance of Miquel Biggs, where when she went missing many years ago, I think it was in the 1990s, that, her parents were very gung-ho about, getting her missing. She went missing from the Phoenix, Arizona area and out there doing interviews and everything else. But at some point they just got burned out, and it went to her sister, Miquel's sister, to then take over the reins. And in fact, that episode is called that. So she is now responsible for keeping her sister's memory alive and doing any interviews and making sure people don't forget about Miquel, because it's still an unsolved disappearance. But a lot of times there is nobody. What if it's an only child? What if this happens? What if that happens? There may not be anybody else to continue pushing the case forward and making sure people don't forget about it. Those are the detriments of time passing. But there are benefits. The benefits, as with anything in life, as time passes, perspective changes. You may think of something in one way in 1991, but here 30 years later, looking at the circumstances, you're able to look at other disappearances, maybe look at those people who are around that missing person at the time and everything. It may actually tell you something different all these years later. It may give you new lines of inquiry that you would not have had at the time that the disappearance happened. The advancement of science, even though we don't talk about DNA too much, but certainly with the progression of DNA, has made identifying unidentified remains a lot easier. And of course, unidentified remains are usually connected to missing persons cases. Another benefit, people talk. If they did do something, maybe their conscience gets to them and they start talking to others and they speak to the wrong person and they give away a good piece of information. And, the investigation can get jump started again, something that would not happen right at the time of the disappearance. People's criminal behavior can be checked. I do this a lot. When we're covering older disappearances, 20, 30 years old, I will go back, I will look at criminal records and see what the suspects have done since then. People around, other witnesses, what have they done with their lives since the time of the disappearance? And what happens if you find out some of these people do have violence in their history and have spent time in jail? Maybe this might generate something new. There's always this, although this is rare. Maybe the missing person really did walk off to start a new life and then comes home one day. That happens. We've had only one, but it's at least one, Patrick Reed, that he went missing. And now it's believed that he really did walk out of his life. And there is proof that he took pictures with a woman he must have been friends with years after his disappearance date. He just left his family, left his friends, went to live with this woman, just never told anybody about it anymore. So with the passage of time, that, of course, can happen as well. And then on top of everything else with the passage of time, maybe someone will come along who cares and actually knows what to do. See, these are benefits of time passing. So it's not always bad. There's a lot of bad with time passing, but there can be some good things with time passing if you know what those things are and how to take advantage of them.
Perfect.
So that's the detriments and benefits of the time passing for missing persons cases.
That's perfect. Now, let me know if we have a minute to go to the Q&A, but also to go to somebody who actually just came on, who will speak for just a few minutes. He's a surprise participant for you. We're honored to have him on with us, taking time out of his busy schedule. But if we could just kind of press pause for a minute and bring him on to talk about the cold cases that were closed August 31st, 2021. These cold cases. And I'm wondering if he might be able to come on and then he can talk to you and speak about that from the perspective, a different perspective, from law enforcement perspective, through law enforcement eyes. Are you there, Sheriff?
Yes, Doctor, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We hear you great.
All right, awesome. I'm sorry. I'm currently in the field, so I just wanted to jump in a car real quick and log in. I have been listening to the discussion, and I got to tell you, Ed's been nailing a lot of really good points, some things we just experienced here. I'll shed some light on what occurred just a few days ago. I mean, it seemed like I just finished this press conference only a few hours ago. Coming into the office now, almost 3 years ago, we recognized that we had an enormous amount of cold cases that had begun to just accumulate, and we really didn't dedicate enough resources to thoroughly investigate and follow up with some of these cases that went back between 5, 10, and in this particular case, 20 years. Over 20 years ago, going back in 2000, we had 3 young ladies who were murdered. The first of which was murdered back in, I believe it was in 2000 in Cooper City. Her body was found packed inside of a suitcase, discarded in Cooper City, one of our cities. The second, shortly thereafter, was a young lady who was also murdered, killed, and this time packed in a duffel bag and left discarded in Dania Beach. And approximately a year after that second killing here in Broward County, the third young lady was killed and found floating in Biscayne Bay down in Miami, just a short trip away from us. And so our investigators had for years, I heard Ed talk briefly about how these cases will often go from one hand to the next. Detectives have come and gone, retired. We've lost employees just to, natural cause of death, but these cases continue to remain in the care and custody of whatever law enforcement agency that may be working them, in this case, the Broward Sheriff's Office. And so I introduced a new cold case unit, put aside some funding to help arm our homicide detectives, which typically in most large law enforcement organizations, and Doc, this coming out of New York City, our homicide is our top investigators. They are seasoned, they're a veteran, and they really dive deep into how they do case management and inquiries with interviewing witnesses, suspects, and just diving deep into this thing. And so one of the things that we were able to recognize was after the third death, and the young lady name was Jessica Good, down in Miami, Miami Police Department had received a tip, city of Miami, received a tip that a young man may have been the potential suspect in this case. And his name was Roberto Fernandez. He was a Brazilian national who had moved to Miami and spent some time here. Interesting enough, as Miami was able to, get on the hot trail, so to speak, the suspect elected to flee and go back to his home country of Brazil. And as you can imagine, this complicates things very much so because Brazil does not have extradition laws with the United States. Therefore, there's no mandate. There's no policy to have, in this case, this individual being arrested and transported back into the United States under our criminal justice system. Now, interesting enough, what we were able to accomplish working with Miami was when the suspect ended up packing these young ladies in these suitcases, our investigators were able to go back, track down where these suitcases were stolen from, and they were able to pull DNA off of both the luggage and the suitcase in itself. Now, the importance behind that was because in the Miami case, a year later, DNA evidence was also left on the scene. And so now we have 3 cases that found its way transmitted into different database systems where there's overlapping interest in this individual. But the one thing that was missing was the ability to actually pull DNA from this individual. Now, fate would show have it, Doc. as law enforcement was getting hot on the trail back in 2005, keeping in mind the first murder was in 2000, the second was also in 2000, and the third was in 2001. So in 2005, this individual apparently was wreaking havoc in Brazil, facing criminal charges for the murder of his own wife and many other different things that was occurring. And as the Brazilian government began to pursue their own criminal charges, he attempted to flee. I believe he was a pilot and ended up deciding to fly out of Brazil. And karma caught up to him where he crashed and died in the plane crash. Now, Ed had just talked about this a moment ago, about sometimes suspects die. Well, here's the beauty. I'm a cop's cop. I want to catch the bad guy. Suspects die, but their DNA remain forever. And so when they buried this individual in Brazil, one of the things our investigators did a phenomenal job working with Miami, working with the State Department, working with the government of Brazil, was to have the body exhumed, allowing us to take a sample and test and compare his DNA. Well, that match came back. We were to confirm that he was indeed responsible for killing all three of these women. And we have reason to believe that he may have been involved in other murders, both here in Florida and elsewhere, to include outside of this country. So, here we are where we're talking about this today. Ed's done a phenomenal job. I popped on. I was listening to you, Ed, probably for about 25 minutes before I got a chance to log on and talk to you.
Thank you.
Well, I think what you're doing, and you're speaking to these realities that we face in law enforcement, and it's very complicated. But one of the things I made clear during our press conference, speaking and talking about this, is justice never expires. There's no expiration date for justice. And so if we have an opportunity to investigate these cases, we have evidence. I can tell you right now, in our agency, we will track you down no matter what part of this planet you are on. It was delightful. You also talk about the difficulties to find family members. We try to track down all the family members for each and every one of the victims. We were successful with one, finding the husband to the first victim who was killed here in Cooper City. And for 20 years, this man has remained patient, confident, and had hoped that we would bring closure to him and his family. And the look on his face, it's irreplaceable. It reminds us about why we do what we do and why we can't give up on these victims. They must have a voice and their families must get closure. So I appreciate you, Doc. Let me jump on and just share that with our classmates and anyone else who's listening and participating, because the ability to investigate cases thoroughly with today's technology and the resources that we have now compared to what we had just 20 years ago, there's a huge increase in our ability to perform. So thanks for letting me share that. I'm out here running around doing cop stuff, but this was important.
Thank you so much, Sheriff, for taking the time. Ed, did you want to comment to Sheriff Tony?
No, that's a great story. That's a great story. I love it when I hear that, you never give up.
You can't.
Yeah.
You can't, Ed. And I tell you, take a look at our publication that we put out on this, because it might be something you might even expand on and talk about in another lecture, because you're right on track with the things that can be discussed.
Excellent. Thank you, Sheriff, for popping on. I know you're busy. Be safe out there. Thank you.
Absolutely. Hey, awesome job. Thanks for getting them on.
Thank you.
Take care, folks.
Okay, thanks, Sheriff. So that was a bit of a surprise, and I don't know if there's any more to the presentation, Ed. If you had more things,
a few more things. Overall, and once again, this is my notes just to wrap all of this up. The question is, why are disappearances important? Because he just got done talking about, I guess we would call this guy a serial killer, and they're actually quite common. However, I will tell you, in disappearances, most of these disappearances that we've covered, I'm inclined to believe they are very, very personal. They are not done by a guy, let's say, who has gone across the United States making multiple people disappear or murdering multiple people. I'm inclined to believe that most of these are just one-time things for the most part. Although I have covered at least one disappearance where it is believed a serial killer is responsible. But so if this is just a one-time thing, if this is a husband who just grew frustrated with his wife, they had a domestic violence and he ended up killing her, then what really is, besides the family, of course, wanting to get resolution and this person going to jail, what does this mean to us as a civilization? Well, I broke down some statistics. Here are some analogies. So far with, of course, COVID, 4.5 million people have died worldwide due to this virus. That is 0.0005% of the world population. It's horrible. It's horrible. But the world keeps going. The Black Plague from the Middle Ages killed 125 million people. That was 30% of the world population died due to the Black Plague, like 700 years ago. But still, once again, civilization, of course, kept going. We're all here. And World War II, 73 million people died during World War II from the late 30s to 1945. That was 0.0365% of the world population. Of course, would be something that a lot of people still remember, even though it's like almost 80 years ago. Yet in all of these situations, civilization has continued. But imagine if any of those amounts, whether it's 0.004% or, of course, 30% or 0.0365% of the population, imagine any of those percentages. Imagine if that percentage of the world population was to just disappear. Do you think that we as a civilization would move on? Would we go on? Or instead, would this cause people to become very paranoid? Would it cause people to start losing, faith in civilization? Will we have some sort of chaos, some sort of anarchy? I would say so, that if we had people going missing at the same rate as some of these other things that have happened in history, that where a lot of people, of course, people died. This is why disappearances have to be taken serious. So we cannot let this get out of control. We have to learn how to solve these, because I truly believe if you do not get a handle on these eventually, and if they grow more and more and more, that society can break down because of them. Just as I've seen families break down because of them not getting solved. I absolutely believe that.
Awesome. So what I want to do now is I want to go to Brendan Callanan. I'd like to bring on Brendan. He's our resident criminal justice undergrad. I'm going to have him spotlighted right now. Add the spotlight.
He's the new guy, right? He's the new guy.
He's the rookie, but he's grown into the position already. Like you can't even believe he's not really a rookie anymore, So, Brendan, what have you heard based on what Ed has shared about, the anatomy of this missing person case in terms of investigating it and in terms of uncovering the facts, the impact that it has on the family, the challenges for law enforcement, the CSI effect, all of these things that we've talked about tonight, and including Sheriff Tony's surprise appearance. So is there any takeaways that you have that you'd like to talk about or ask Ed specifically?
Yeah, if you could just wrap that all up in about 30 seconds.
Oh, yeah, of course. First of all, thank you both for having me on. This has been great. What a show we had tonight. This is awesome. One question I had for you, though, was do you believe the majority of the walk-off cases that you were talking about, do you believe the majority of those end up in like an accident similar to the drunk driving accident that you mentioned earlier?
I do. I know that it does not make some of my guests very happy when I talk to them about this, and I would never name any particular disappearance or guest in particular regarding, I don't do that. But I know that over the last 5 years, my eyes have been open to the idea that, what, this does go on. And really what you really have to look at is what was going on in that person's life right before they disappeared. And a lot of times you're going to hear things about a relationship going bad, maybe having some sort of mental issue, bipolar issue, paranoia issue, maybe a new drug issue. It is amazing, depression. It is amazing in those types of disappearances. When you start talking about just the days and weeks before that happened, how most of these people were going through things like that. Yes.
Yeah, I found that really fascinating because especially with the CSI effect that we're talking about, like whenever you hear of a case like that, you automatically think there's like some crazy story to go along with it. And to kind of hear you break down like how it really is, kind of puts it into perspective, and you can kind of see how these cases might have happened a little bit easier, I feel like.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I think the public in general I think the public in general wants to believe that most of these are murders. And I do believe that. But I think that the public underestimates the number of walk-offs that occur because, we don't ever want to admit that somebody really just walked out of his or her life, like the pressure got too much or they were going through this or through that, because that might paint that person in a bad light. And so we're more inclined to believe, because we want to think the best of people. Well, that person surely wouldn't have walked away from his family. That mother wouldn't have walked away from her children. Surely they must have been murdered. The only issue is that in other cases where they aren't disappearances, actually they're solved quite quickly. We do know of parents and children that walk off and commit suicide, and those things happen. So I think it's just kind of a little bit of bias going on there. But the reality is I think people walk off more than we realize.
And one final question I had from one of the audience members, Jahan Clark. She was wondering, how is it determined which case or which family would get more media presence than another one? I thought that was a very good question for.
It's still something that I don't think I've figured out. Certainly, when children go missing, they get more attention than when adults go missing. And certainly when you start breaking that down, the people who get the least amount of attention going missing are the people that, if I'm just going to be honest, that the media finds out, well, this woman was a prostitute. This guy had a drug addiction. This guy is a criminal. Those types of people, if the media finds out about that, it's not that they won't cover it, but it certainly will not get as much attention. It's just, they find it a lot easier. They want ready-made stories that, well, this fine, upstanding person went missing, and that's a lot easier to cover.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And enter the labeling theory,
Yes.
that in criminological theory, the sociological explanation for criminal behavior, labeling. Well, we can explain criminal behavior via that theory, but we also can maybe apply the labeling theory and stigma to how important investigators, or how much value do they place on the victim and take seriously the case if it involves someone who's a sex worker, if it involves someone who's drug addicted, etc. So it's almost like the value of the human being and the value of the case and the victim is determined by the identity and determined by, this label that they have placed on them by society. So that's very unfair. And that makes it more difficult for the family. It makes it more difficult for the investigation of the case. We see this with juries where, doubt is beyond a reasonable doubt, right? That's the level of proof. And it's easy to raise doubt when the victim or the witness is a sex worker. The victim or a witness is someone who's addicted to drugs. And so what happens is it raises that level of doubt in the minds of the jury that this person didn't deserve to live, didn't deserve to, fill in the blank. So
you could probably bring up an example, though. Once again, I'm not a serial killer expert, but like Gary Ridgway, most of the women that he murdered were sex workers, were prostitutes, many, many, many.
Right.
Of course, I'm still debating the number. It might be in the 40s or 50s,
right?
That he murdered. What if all of those women had been college professors? Do you think he ever gets anywhere near that number?
Right.
Of course not.
Right.
Because after about the third one, there would have been, lockdowns and everything else. But being that it's Sex workers, well, not that we don't care or anything. Of course, their families care, but
Exactly.
he was still free to kill like 40, 50 women before he got caught. I don't think that would have happened if they would have all been college professors.
Right. And, we've seen some of the old classical sociologists, criminologists discuss things like victim precipitation and looking at the victim's behavior as almost a blaming the victim for their own demise kind of thing, instead of focusing the attention on the perpetrator and the suspect. And so we've seen that in the past, and we've seen that in theories, in criminological.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, we all take risks in our lives. I mean, jumping in our car and driving to work is risky, but if we get into a wreck that's not our fault, we're not to blame because we got in the car. It's
Right.
risky to drive a car, but it's a person who went through the stop sign that caused it.
I'll go even further. I forget to lock my car.
Yeah.
Okay. I forget to lock my car. Is that my fault? Am I to blame?
Or if it gets robbed, right? If it gets robbed, yeah.
Right. Am I supposed to be focused my attention on the perpetrator who's got no business going into my unlocked car and stealing my stuff? Right.
Yes,
So
right.
it's all that same mindset, but all of this plays into the investigation end of it, in terms of how the victim is viewed, how the case is viewed, the length of the case being unsolved plays a role, as we just now mentioned. And therein, and at the end of the day, the final analysis, the bottom line is that the family has lost a loved one, and that person has kind of frozen in time.
Yep. For every guest, it's the day after the disappearance. No
Right.
matter if it's 1 year old, 20 years old, it's always the day after the disappearance.
Yeah. And Jahan is saying, I would think the same when it comes to race. Society loves to blame the victim, Nakia says. Absolutely. Absolutely. We see that with sexual assault victims all the time. One of the reasons why it's the most unreported crime to the police. What's that about? Is there a lack of trust in the police? Is there a fear of retaliation? Is there a fear you won't be believed?
Yeah.
And the list goes on. Brendan, thank you for being with us. Thank you for all the work you do behind the scenes.
Nice meeting you. I guess we'll be seeing each other again.
Yes,
absolutely.
Every month.
Yes. So now we're trying to figure out behind the scenes, Ed, just so you know, a big venue for your lecture.
All right, great. I'll be ready.
You know what the problem is?
It's a problem.
We got a problem, right?
COVID.
Yes, we have a problem, and its name is COVID. So we're going to do our best.
We'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. We'll work behind the scenes, and I don't care if we have to go in the middle of campus and on the grass and have a picnic.
Just give me a soapbox.
We'll build you a little platform. I have a speaker system. We can get you out there on the grass, throw a little frisbee, do a little golf, disc golf.
That's fun.
On campus. But we're set for November 4th, no matter what. Brendan and I are going to do our best to try to find a venue that works for everybody. And but we have another show next month.
Sure, let's do it. Absolutely.
We have to pick a date. We'll do that offline.
Okay.
Any closing remarks, Ed? Tell us about where we can find you if we're interested.
Well, tomorrow we are celebrating the 5-year anniversary of the program by replaying the first interview I ever did with the mother of Susie Lyle, disappearance that's still unsolved from Albany, New York. But that's will be found on iTunes, Spotify, and I just found out within the last couple of days, this coming week, Unfound is going to be specially featured on Amazon. Somehow we earned that honor. But I found that out. So starting tomorrow for a week, there's going to be a special place on Audible or Amazon Podcasts or something like that, where Unfound is going to be featured with some other select programs.
Awesome.
But Podomatic, it's great. And of course, we have the YouTube channel, very popular, Unfound podcast channel, the website, theunfoundpodcast.com. We're on Facebook page, the Facebook group, Instagram, Twitter. Just do a search for Unfound, the podcast, the Missing Persons program.
Fabulous. I want to thank all of the students I know that you have a lot of your followers that are on tonight. And I have a lot of my students that are on tonight, and I appreciate their attendance and I appreciate their participation. We've been blowing up the YouTube chat comments
good.
here. So that's really
Good.
great. Tried to get as many as we could out there in the time frame. And also, please take a look, for those of you who are watching this now or in the recording, please take a look at all of the links that we've placed in the chat for our undergrad program, for our graduate program, and for our PhD program in criminal justice. We have a premier program, premier school of criminal justice. And I want to thank Dean Durham and Dr. Marcelo Castro, who run, and Dr. Tammy Kushner, who run this school. And we appreciate them so much. Also, if you have not subscribed yet to our YouTube channel, please do so. All you have to do is just hit the subscribe and then also hit the bell so that you get notified whenever we go live. I would like to shamelessly plug, and actually, Brendan, if you have the dates, can you just tell our viewers the two big things that are coming up? One is a police and youth initiative program that we're going to be talking about with a professor from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And her name is Dr. Nina Fisher. So Brendan, I'm going to actually just, I'm going to share your video here so you can pop in and let us know the date for that, if you don't mind.
Of course. I'm just going to pull up that date real quick.
So this is Dr. Nina Rose Fisher from John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and she's involved in a program with youth and police. And it's a beautiful strategy that's bringing them together, the police and youth in her community. And we're going to bring her on, and I believe it's October 7th, if I'm not mistaken. I'm thinking.
Yes, October 7th.
October 7th. And then we have October 21st, Brendan?
Correct again.
Okay, October 21st is going to be Dr. Catherine Ramsland and Professor Sharon Plotkin. Dr. Catherine Ramsalin is the author of To Catch a Killer and Confessions of a Serial Killer. She interviewed the BTK killer for 5 years, and she's still in touch with him. So she's going to be coming on. She's a forensic psychology professor. Sharon Plotkin is a CSI expert. That's October 21st, 7 o'clock. The name of that is To Catch a Killer. So we're going to be looking at the behavioral, forensic, and investigative aspects of serial killers, serial murderers. So that's two different programs. And we will definitely be announcing our next Unfound, the next Unfound that we have episode with Ed. So thank you all. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Last words, Ed?
As always, it was great to do another show with you, Dr. Telesco. Thank you,
Great.
Dr. Telesco.